Right now, a totally fascinating web of events is actively redrawing the map of Europe. Okay, let's dive into this. In today's explainer, we're going to connect the dots across the source material to reveal the macro narrative of Europe's rapidly evolving security, economic, and diplomatic landscape. From the battlefields of the East to the glamorous boardrooms of Monaco, all the way to the power grids of Slovakia, the tectonic plates of European stability are literally shifting in real time. Here's the roadmap for what we'll cover today. First, the shifting momentum in Ukraine. Second, how key allies are being divided by history. Third, reshaping European security alliances. Fourth, energy and climate strains. And finally, we'll get the view from Washington.
All right, part one, shifting momentum in Ukraine, from long-range strikes to cross-border fallout.
Let's look at the current battlefield dynamic through a kind of shrinking timeline. On day one, we have Ukraine launching a long-range drone strike directly hitting the Dubna Space Communications Center over in the Moscow Oblast. So why does this matter? Well, because this isn't just some random building. It supports Russia's critical military communications, their satellite operations, and intelligence. Zoom out to an 8-day window and you realize this is actually the second time Ukraine has targeted this exact same facility in just over a week. Zoom out even further to the 40-day mark and a really clear deliberate strategy emerges. Ukraine is executing a stated 40-day campaign of long-range sanctions. They're systematically targeting refineries and communication centers and heavily focusing on cutting the Crimean Peninsula off from the Russian mainland. The whole goal here? To build up so much pressure that it essentially forces the Kremlin to the negotiating table.
But as this conflict intensifies, the consequences are violently spilling over borders in ways you really wouldn't expect. Take the tranquil Principality of Monaco, for example. An unprecedented parcel bombing just recently took place at a residential building there. The target? Vadim Yermolayev. He's a major real estate developer and construction tycoon who actually renounced his Ukrainian citizenship for a Cypriot one and was placed under Ukrainian sanctions in late 2023. This explosion was caused by a device deliberately packed with bolts and metal scraps just to maximize destruction. It critically wounded Yermolayev, his wife, and their 13-year-old son. It's just a stark, brutal reminder that the shockwaves of this war are reaching far beyond the front lines, going right into the heart of Western Europe.
Moving to part two, allies divided by history, diplomatic frictions between Poland and Ukraine.
100,000. That is an incredibly sobering number. It represents the Polish casualties who died in border regions during World War II at the hands of the Ukrainian insurgent army. And right now, this deeply contested history is surging back into the present. See, Ukrainian President Zelensky recently moved to honor distinguished Ukrainians, establishing a national pantheon for heroes of Ukrainian resistance, making it clear that no one will dictate who Ukraine honors in its fight for independence. But, from the Polish perspective, honoring groups associated with those 100,000 deaths is deeply, deeply problematic. The friction has actually gotten so severe that Poland's defense minister recently warned this whole issue could have negative effects on Warsaw's support for Ukraine's accession to the European Union.
And this brilliantly illustrates how a historical grievance can rapidly freeze modern-day cooperation. Just look at their shared defense priorities as an example. Poland offered a super practical trade. They provide MiG fighter jets, and Ukraine provides drone capabilities. Simple, right? Well, the expectations on both sides fell entirely flat. Ukraine accepted the proposal but never implemented the drone deliveries. Consequently, Poland withheld the MiGs. The whole partnership just stalled out. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has emphasized that this is definitely not the time for picking on historical scabs. Experts are pointing out that the only party who truly benefits from this kind of diplomatic rift between Warsaw and Kyiv is Vladimir Putin.
All right, part three, reshaping European security alliances, expanding defense architecture with Turkey.
Just days ahead of a historic NATO summit in Ankara, we saw high-level EU officials, including Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, travel to Turkey. The core dynamic here is pretty straightforward. Ankara wants recognition as a central player in European security. They are aggressively pointing to their massive defense industry, their incredibly strategic geographic location, and their undeniable status as NATO's second-largest military. They absolutely do not want to be an outsider looking in. They want to be a foundational pillar of Europe's expanding defense architecture.
But the diplomatic reality here is basically a giant knot of conflicting motivations. Turkey is seeking deeper ties, largely motivated by a desire to access the EU's massive €150 billion defense loan program. Meanwhile, the EU is operating on pure pragmatism. With the war in Ukraine and instability in the Middle East, Brussels urgently needs robust security cooperation right now. But here's the catch. Participation in that loan program requires unanimous approval from EU member states. And Greece and Cyprus hold the power to veto, citing long-standing historical disputes in Turkey's stalled EU accession process. So you've got immediate security needs crashing headfirst into entrenched historical vetoes.
Part 4. Energy and climate strains. Power grids under pressure.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how one single country is completely changing its energy profile to deal with grid pressures. After nearly 40 years of construction, the fourth unit at the Mokchove nuclear plant in Slovakia is finally loading fuel. Once this is online, it's going to boost Slovakia's nuclear power share to a massive 77% of their total power production. This effectively pushes them right past France as the EU's top nuclear power generator by percentage. The main motivation here? Ending their historical dependence on Russian fossil fuels. But the source material highlights a critical vulnerability. Relying so heavily on a single massive source means that if an adversary wanted to knock out the Slovakian grid, they wouldn't even need to target the whole country. They'd literally just need to target the high-voltage substation connecting that single plant to the wider grid. So it solves one security issue but creates a brand new one. And honestly, it's not just security threats straining the grid. It's the climate. The German insurer Allianz just projected a staggering number, $600 billion. That is the potential hit to the GDP of Europe's biggest economies by the year 2030, driven entirely by the economic fallout from intensifying heat waves and extreme weather.
To put that massive $600 billion projection into perspective, just look at the cascading, micro-level infrastructure failures happening right now. We're talking about a 20 to 30% decrease in crucial agricultural production due to heat and drought. In Poland, up to 260 trains had to be canceled in a single afternoon because extreme temperatures overloaded the overhead line substations, totally cutting the power supply. And in France, the national utility EDF was actually forced to physically shut down nuclear reactors because the river waters used to cool them became too hot. When you add in the surging use of air conditioning across the continent, you're looking at a European power grid that is just buckling under historic pressure.
Finally, Part 5. The view from Washington. The transatlantic picture.
We've looked at the European perspective, but to understand what this looks like from across the Atlantic, we have to turn to the insights of former U.S. Special Envoy General Keith Kellogg. He provided a remarkably blunt assessment of the U.S. diplomatic approach to Russia, particularly when he was advising the Trump administration. He noted that some advisors with business backgrounds, like real estate, tend to approach diplomacy as a business deal, relying on personal relationships to change behavior. General Kellogg's steadfast counter to this, once a KGB guy, always a KGB guy. He argues that business-minded diplomacy fundamentally fails to grasp that a leader with Putin's background is driven by territorial gains, not just a desire for a good deal. He stressed that Washington advisors face a super steep learning curve in understanding that you can't just convince a leader to change their foundational ambitions through the sheer dint of personality.
So the crucial point is, what should Europe do? Interestingly, General Kellogg aligns pretty closely with the views of Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski, arguing for a radical shift toward European self-reliance. Step 1. He says Europe needs to tell the U.S. to take a back seat on negotiations. Step 2. They need to capitalize on the vast military capacity already sitting right there in Europe, from producing first-class gear like the Swedish Gripen fighters to relying on the massive nuclear umbrella provided by France's submarines. This would allow the rest of Europe to confidently provide conventional support. And Step 3. They need to command their own geopolitical neighborhood.
As Kellogg provocatively framed it to European leaders, think about it. Cuba is in America's backyard, and Europe doesn't interfere. Ukraine is in Europe's backyard. Therefore, Europe absolutely must take the strategic lead. The capacity is there, the military hardware is there, and as we've seen throughout this whole explainer, the pressing need is for sure there. So the only question left as we wrap up today's deep dive into the source material is this: will Europe actually step up to secure its own backyard? It is a question that will undoubtedly define the geopolitical landscape for the next decade. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next explainer.